Warwick, Rhode Island, to interview and talk with my dad, to have a little retrospect of his life, and just to ask a few questions so we have this forever recorded for my posterity and for his other children and loved ones. Um, we're going to start with just some open-ended questions and some chance just to have Dad talk a little bit about his life. He was born on May 11th, 1935. And we're going to start back then and take us this session through his early childhood years. So, how are you, Dad? How are you feeling?
I'm fine.
Why are you here today? Why did you come up today?
It's a wonderful opportunity. Why did I come up? Because I love to visit my four lovely daughters all at different times, and this was a wonderful opportunity that I'd been looking forward to since Christmas, because Jennifer had just moved into a new house and she wanted me to see what it was like, and I want to very much because of the change in location. And now her three wonderful children had an opportunity to have their own rooms. And I think that grandchildren are very important. One of the things that I never really appreciated was my grandparents. And I think part of it was because they never were very well, very much known to me.
Not as involved in your lives. And we've been really lucky because while for as long as our children have been alive, we've lived only about 3 hours from my dad, from you, Dad, and you have been a part of their lives from, I think when Alice was born, you came and spent your Thanksgiving with us when he was only 2 weeks old.
Mm-hmm.
And so really from the fact that you're a total and complete part of my life, but mostly that my own children have known their grandparents. And that's one of the reasons why I want to record this too, so that over the years, we can look back on this
Sure.
time. And remember, this is one of many visits. Dad comes up and just hangs around, part of the family.
Yeah, that's one of the nice things about being able to come up here, because there's no pressure to be doing anything particular,
Yeah,
and
so nice.
it's like an extension of home.
Mm-hmm.
And of course it's a lot different in that I have the opportunity to be with the grandchildren and my wonderful daughter and her great
Wait. Did you
husband.
say your wonderful daughter? Did you mean your favorite daughter?
My favorite second oldest daughter, to be sure.
Oh, it's so great. It's
That's
so
a
great
joke
having
in the
Dad
family,
here. Yeah. What I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about your earliest memories, because those are the ones that I probably know the least about. And while I knew Grandma and Grandpa, and I'm so grateful for having known them all basically uh, through my 30s, I knew my grandparents very well, and so a lot of the memories that I have of them are their life's experiences and having interacted with them throughout their lives. But I don't know much about your early childhood years, and so we're going to get this on tape. So what I want to do is just have you talk to me about a little bit about where you were born and where your family's travels took you till you started high school. So let's start with from your earliest memories of your birth through about your 12th year. Tell me about where you
Okay, well,
traveled.
first of all, my memories are quite vague, and most of them are as a result of watching old movies or thinking about old movies, because my mother and father took copious films, and I think that's great because we still have them, and they can use them to refresh our memories. But of course, a lot of the memorable events were not recorded. Uh, and I guess the best thing to do is to start at a 11 May 1935, where I was born at West Point in the military academy. My father was teaching Spanish, and my grandmother Harris and grandfather Harris lived in Cornwall, which is about 7 miles away from West Point. And my father had met my mother while he was teaching at West Point, and she lived part of the time in Cornwall, which my grandmother, the house was built by my grandmother, and part of the time in Philadelphia. Um, we stayed in Cornwall at West Point, where we lived in I think we lived in the bachelor officers' quarters because there weren't sufficient quarters for um, young families, and there were a number of them there at that particular time.
What rank was Grandpa at that time, Dad?
Grandfather Bell was a first lieutenant. He'd graduated from West Point
Okay.
in 1927,
Okay.
and so this was, my mother and father were married in 1934, so he'd already been in the Army for 7 years, and promotion was very slow at that time. So being a first lieutenant, I believe he was about the normal
Right.
rate of promotion as
Yeah.
it
That
stood.
was between wars, so he wouldn't have had any of his illustrious military career by that point.
No,
Okay.
no. But he had played baseball at West Point, and in between he was he wanted his major letter, what they call a major A, as a cadet, and broke his leg playing baseball. So I guess he didn't get to play against the
Right?
Navy
Oh.
team. But your grandfather was from Florida, the youngest of 7 children. Your grandmother Belle was the oldest of 2 children. Her younger brother died when he was 13 and she was 18,
She was 18.
and that was a very traumatic event in the family. So I never got to know my uncle. And because I was the oldest child and the son, I was considered, very special by grandparents on my grandmother's side. My grandmother I never knew my grandfather on my father's side, and I hardly knew my grandmother. That's why I don't have any reminiscences.
Yeah, where were they living? Were they still in Florida? Were they in
They were in
Pensacola at
Florida.
that time?
They were living in
Okay.
Florida, and they did not have the means to travel, so
Yeah.
they didn't. But your grandmother, your great grandmother Harris, my grandmother Harris, traveled and helped very often with my sisters,
Mm-hmm.
because in 1937 we moved to Hawaii,
Oh.
and lived on the island of Oahu at Schofield Barracks, and there my oldest sister Betsy, or Elizabeth, was born. She was named after my grandmother Harris.
Okay, sure.
And my father there was a company commander of a company which had a lot of machine guns in it. It was called the Machine Gun Company. And Schofield Barracks is a beautiful army post, which you might have remembered that we visited very briefly when I went to Vietnam in
Yeah, because we stayed in Oahu, didn't we?
1968. We stayed on Hawaii, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Schofield Barracks.
And so Betsy was born there, and then we moved back. From there, we went to from there to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri, which is another Army post. It was just outside of St. Louis, very old Army post overlooking the Mississippi River.
So can I interrupt, Dad? So you left a very supportive home environment near Cornwall, where Grandma's parents were, and went way 13, 14 hours to the opposite side of the world, basically, as a young toddler. And then your first sibling was born in Hawaii, and then you moved back.
And, well, Carolyn was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, when my father was stationed at Jefferson Barracks. So I don't know that we could call it a very supportive family environment. Cornwall was always the base of operations.
Yeah.
So wherever we came back to, we were always coming back to Cornwall. And so I always considered Cornwall really my home, although I never really lived there for.
You didn't live there till you yourself were an adult. Is that right? Did you formerly live in Cornwall? Did Grandma ever move to By the Wood while you were still living at home? I never realized that whether you lived in that house or not.
No, I never really lived in that house until. Never lived in the house, to be honest with you. But of course, I had my room.
That you stayed in when you were there. Whenever you went to
Stayed when I was there. Let's see. Let's just to follow.
Yeah.
We went to
Let's go back.
in 1940. My sister Carolyn was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. My father was on temporary duty in Arkansas. Think a place called Camp Robinson, which is still in existence,
Okay.
and there's a National Guard post for Arkansas. And then my father went back to West Point to teach again,
Mhm.
and there in 1942 my sister Barbara was born,
Okay, so you're back at West Point.
and we stayed there for maybe about 3 years until 1943.
Do you have a remembrance of where around at West Point you lived at that time?
We
You
lived
were
at
in
a
different
place
quarters.
called Quarters 14, which is a big, great big house with many bedrooms, and your grandfather was a captain then,
Okay.
which meant that he was almost the beginning of the Second World War
Okay.
for us, not for Europeans, because Europeans were already at
But
war.
at war. So you're
But,
stationed at West Point at that time. Okay,
you know, and
1943.
our father was teaching Spanish again. It was his second tour teaching Spanish. And then in 1943, we moved to Oregon.
Oregon.
And by that time, my grandfather Harris had died, and my grandmother Harris came with us.
Oh.
And I went with my father and mother and oldest sister. We drove across the country to visited friends along the way, my parents' friends, not my friends,
Right.
and ended up in a little town called some kind of junction in, right outside of Corvallis, Oregon.
Okay, and that's where you lived.
And then, well, we lived there for the summer. Then we moved into town of Corvallis, bought a house in 1943, 1944. My father was at Camp Adair and helped organize a division. At that time, he was a lieutenant colonel, so promotion was very fast in those
Okay.
days. Of course, that was, you know, we were at war,
Right.
and so we lived there. I went to school in third grade. I had been at school at West Point for 3 years, kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, and then went
Okay.
third grade in Oregon. And then my father went to war in 1944, so we went back east again.
Mhm.
That was myself and my mother and my sisters. And I and my mother drove together. Let's see, I was 8 years old then. We drove from Oregon back to Cornwall, where my grandmother had taken my three sisters. I think
So
that
she had
was-
flown, and you and Grandma.
No, we didn't. They went by train.
Oh,
In
by
those days,
train,
you didn't
right.
fly. But we drove in this car. We had a Ford convertible, four-door
Oh, really?
Ford convertible, which is a wonderful car, and which lasted until, because it had to last through the war.
Yeah.
But we drove it all the way out to Oregon, and then drove it all the way back to Oregon.
So Grandma drove by herself then, because Grandpa was.
Coming back. Well, we actually went to one of the officers in your grandfather's organization was a man by the name of John Hinckley,
Oh, you're the Hinckley family,
and
sure.
they were very
Oh.
prominent in the Church of Jesus
Jesus
Christ of
Christ.
Latter-day Saints. And I can remember driving from Oregon to Ogden, Utah, and John Hinckley had to climb up onto the porch and climb in the window because the doors were locked at the house. So we stayed there for the night, and then I think we had another officer who drove part way to Chicago, and then from Chicago we drove to Cornwall, and there's where we kind of all reassembled. I can remember spending the summer there in 1943. No, I'm sorry, summer 1944, learning my multiplication tables, because
That's right, at 9 years old.
when I left Oregon, we were just learning how to multiply 3 times 3.
Uh-huh.
Of course, I've been telling your children all
Yeah.
about that, particularly since they all know their multiplication tables before they even get to third grade, or so it seems. I'm not sure about that.
No, but you're right. About third grade is when they get introduced to them.
Yeah.
So it's funny you would remember that, but you're right. About age 9 is when they start introducing that to them.
Well, the reason I remembered is because
Yeah.
we were going to go and live not in Cornwall but in Jericho, Long Island, which was out near Hempstead. Long Island. Mother had rented a house. We had some relatives living on Long Island. Famous polo plane,
Leboutier, that's
Leboutier's
right.
and
Oh, Grandma
Stevenson family lived out there. So, but in order for me to enter the fourth grade, I had to learn my multiplication table. So I had to learn during that summer all the way up times 12 times 12 was 140.
So had you finished the school year in Oregon?
Yeah, we finished the school year in
Okay, so
Oregon.
you traveled and spent the
came
summer in
back,
Jericho.
Spent the summer in Cornwall, which is summers are always great to spend in Cornwall because there was always lots of room to run around and play around and I never had too much to do with my sisters because they were girls and I was a boy and they, you know, they played with their dolls, I guess.
Because they were pretty close in age, the three of them. They must have
Yeah,
been...
although Betsy always tried to kind of keep herself away from she was always thought that she was a little bit, wasn't going to associate too much with her two youngest.
So Barbara was born where, Dad? I missed that. It was
Barbara was born at West Point, 1942. I think I mentioned.
Okay,
I
you
mentioned
probably
that.
did. All right, I
Yeah,
have
I
to make
mentioned
sure.
that.
Because, so the three of them are, the three girls are now born at this point. So there's four of you. That's
There are four of us now.
and Grandpa's away.
Yeah, that's right. And then in 19, so we went down to Westbury, Jericho, Long Island, and lived in this house, rented a house during the war. And I went to school in the fourth grade, and that was a very good year for me, as a matter of fact, because I'd come from a school system in Oregon which was clearly inferior. Went to a school system which was truly superior. And at the end of end of the fourth grade, if I had stayed there, they wanted to skip me to the sixth grade, which I thought was
Wow.
pretty significant. But anyway,
Very significant.
that was the end of the war, and I came back and went back to Cornwall with, I was 10 years old, and we all went back to Cornwall, and in late August, Grandmother came down with polio, and this at the time I didn't realize it was probably a turning point in our life, because your grandmother was a vivacious, vigorous woman who never stopped going. She was a dynamo. And if you see movie pictures of her, she's always going at 150 miles an hour.
Just doing 100 things with four young children. And was she involved in civic things? Do you remember?
No, well, not really. She was very much involved. She loved to read, and she had all kinds of books, and she was in reading clubs and that kind of, particularly when she was at West Point. And she liked to take her hand at writing. She had terrible handwriting.
Even as a young woman,
But she when we were living at West Point, she did this was in the early 1940s, before she got sick. She wrote a book about West Point and had it illustrated, and it was really, I think it's somewhere around someplace.
Oh.
I'm sure that it is. But she did not. One of the things she said she always lacked was stickability. So she never really kind of, carried. I don't think she never did find a publisher for the.
Right. She never carried it through to the.
Yeah. But anyway.
So she contracted polio.
Contracted polio. She was one of the 2 cases in the county for that particular year. And of course, polio at that time was really a crippling disease. And so she went initially to West Point. We were in quarantine. The family was in quarantine for 2 weeks. Nobody else in the family got
it.
And she then went to the Helen Hayes Rehabilitation Center down at Haverstraw and came home to West Point because my father was called back from overseas, reassigned to teach Spanish again at West Point, and went to, and then we moved to Quarters 23, which was another large, big house. Actually, it was part of a triplex, but it was a gigantic place, a lovely house.
Still standing.
Yeah, all these quarters are still.
Okay, still.
Quarters 14 when we were there first time that I remember, and then Quarters 23. And then grandfather was reassigned to go to school in Washington the National War College, which was a very significant and very, for him, a particularly propitious assignment. He had done very well in the war. He was the second highest decorated man in his class from West Point, and won eight different medals for bravery, to include the second highest, the Distinguished Service Cross. So he, instead of being demoted at the end of the year, like many officers were, he retained his rank of colonel, and then they assigned him to the National War College, the first class of the National War College after the war in Washington, D.C. And then we moved to Washington, where we lived for 3 years. I went to the 6th grade there, 7th grade, and most of the 8th grade, and then we went to England. You said you wanted to cut off about age 13.
Yeah, I do.
So
I want to stop here because they're actually, so you made another move in the middle of elementary school, you transitioned into middle school.
I went from Jericho, Long Island, 4th grade. I went to 5th grade and part of the time in Cornwall, and then the rest of the year at West Point. And that was a hard year.
Yeah.
And then, I was in the honor roll there at West Point.
So you maintained even during a difficult time with your mom's, because as you said, your grandma had been so vibrant and probably very physically involved in your life, and now all of a sudden, not only was she in rehabilitation, but she was incapacitated.
Yeah,
She wasn't in a wheelchair then.
except that my father was always considered by my mother a loner.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was the only son, I was really a loner too. I had friends,
Right.
but I wasn't involved with my sisters, like,
Yeah.
and I didn't have a younger brother. So
Right,
that was an entirely different situation than that. And during these years, I had started to develop a collection of toy soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a primary, for a long time, a very long time, has been a hobby of mine, although today the hobby is kind of transferred to my great-grandchildren.
Yeah.
I'm not my great-grandchildren, but my wonderful
Well, they are
grandchildren.
great grandchildren.
Yeah.
Now, Dad, do you think that moving around a lot as a mother of 3 young children who just had to make a move, do you think that contributed, one, to your fact that you became a little more of a self-entertaining, self-sufficient young man? Do you think that was a detriment at all to your education and to your social development at all, having had moved a lot when you were a young child? Because so many young children of Army and military personnel do make that. Do you think that affected your life, your personality?
No, I think first of all, it wasn't something that was unusual for me. I mean,
Yeah, you're used
to move around, because we had the base in Cornwall, it was always a matter of coming back to Cornwall. So it was a challenge every time we went someplace, but I never thought of it as particularly being a challenge or being unusual.
It was just
I mean, it was just the way life was. And I don't think I suffered at all. As a matter of fact, I think that it really worked to my advantage. I developed a great feeling for geography. I love geography and history. And so I felt challenged, although I didn't even know what the word challenge meant at the time. But I really felt challenged by all these different things that I did. And it was very interesting. My mother and my father weren't the touchy-feely kind of people. But there was an aura of love in the family that kind of permeated everything. The concern of my mother and my father for the family. So and it was never a matter of ever feeling that I never had the feeling that I wasn't loved or appreciated or thing. I remember one particular time when my father was very judicious in his punishment. I had been enlisting, as I would say, toy soldiers from a local store without paying for their figures. And through a set of circumstances, I was discovered. And grandfather punished me for expropriation of these men for my army, 15 cents a piece, and I thought that they cost too much at 15 cents a piece. But anyway.
Did he make you pay for them? How did he punish
No,
you?
I took them all back.
Yeah.
But instead of treating me as a very errant child, and setting me to my room and spanking me and switching me, he never spanked. He had switches.
Yeah.
Because that's what when he was a boy, his mother used to switch him if he was a bad boy. But he confined me to the house for 3 days, I guess it was. And I remember that as being a very fair punishment for and a relatively adult type of punishment, as opposed to being treated as a naughty child.
Yeah.
He treated me as a responsible, or an irresponsible as it was, adult instead of a naughty child. And that was one of the things that always kind of stuck in my mind afterwards.
Did you have a lot of time when Grandpa was teaching at West Point? Certainly when he was away, you don't have much interaction with him. Did he ever take an interest in your hobbies? And actually, how old were you when you remember first starting your first collections? Because with all that traveling...
Well,
So those are two questions. One, did Grandpa get involved in that? And two, when do you... Give me a kind of a timeline about when you really started. Was that when you were in 6th grade or younger?
One of the questions that you had asked was one of my favorite memories of my father, and I had a little bit of trouble trying to figure that out. I can remember when we were at Jefferson Barracks, and honestly, I must have been 4 or 5 years old. Grandfather was a captain, and came back in the evening from duty. Because in those days, the duty wasn't really very hard, and they weren't away for very long, except for when they were on maneuvers. And I can remember waiting for him at the door to come back to the house. And the first thing that I wanted to do was to sit down and draw for me rows and rows on lined paper, tanks and very simple line drawings of tanks and guns and trucks and tanks and guns and trucks. And he was very patient about doing that. And then I would do is I would take them and cut them in strips and then make these organizations.
Really?
And to this day, that's where I trace my love for organization back to this kind of thing. And then I remember that when we were living at West Point, when I was 7 or 8, I was always building things. I was building armored cars, or I was building trains, or I was building boats.
With blocks and with
No, with hammers and hammers and nails.
Really?
And my father's main of my father's existence was that he bought all these hammers, and I kept losing them. When I was accused, when I was 2 years old, of burying, and when we were living in Hawaii, of taking my mother's pens and pencils and stuff like that and bury them in the lawn. And she says, "You always want to go back and figure out, you take a metal detector and find out all the things that I had buried there." But I don't know why. I never could remember why I kept losing these things, and I think part of it was because I never really concentrated on anything.
Yeah.
And even to this day, I still have problems on concentrating. You can tell me something, and I'll say yes, and then I'll forget it because I just never really. And I think that may be part of the reason that my mother was such a fidgety Jim.
Yeah.
I don't think she ever really concentrated, and I think I may have picked up that trait from
Except
her.
that so few children start a hobby as a young person and continue it throughout a lifetime. And talk about a stickability. I mean, this is something that was a hobby, but it almost became a vocation in terms of the fact that it wasn't just collecting for the sake of collecting. I mean, it was an exercise in history and geography,
No.
and that's something you stayed with all your life.
Well,
What do you attribute that to? 'Cause
part of it was there was a dichotomy here between my mother and my father. My father had practically, his favorite toy was a stick. His only toy was a stick and a hoop. My mother, I don't think she ever really wanted for anything. I mean, she had beautiful dolls, but she had mostly books. I mean,
She was a
the
big
books
reader.
that she had from childhood, well, I mean, she just was a voracious reader.
Hmm.
And I think that's where you, your sisters, and your grandchildren have all maybe have picked up
Yeah, that love
that
of
as
reading.
well. That as well. Um, but and I can remember that my soldier collection was something you could do by yourself. Not because
Yes.
I didn't have to share them with
Mm-hmm.
my brother. I didn't have a brother to share them with. I also collected stamps. But
Hmm.
I can remember when we were in Oregon, the big thing was paper soldiers. And I had paper soldiers coming out the gazoo.
Papers.
And they come in sheets and you cut them out and you'd put them up on stands and that kind of thing. Because in those days you couldn't get, and box cereals came in boxes, and on the backs of the boxes were cut out of tanks and trucks and stuff like that. So there's a big concentration on the military, particularly in the war. And from time to time, I can remember the Stillmans who lived across the street from us, who had actually in Cornwall.
In Cornwall, yeah.
I got a large number of figures from the Stillman family because they knew my father was in the army, that I was interested in the military, and they didn't have any use for him.
Is that
And
right?
still have some of those figures in my collection.
Because I would wonder who would have given you your first metal soldier. Because as you say, when you traveled a lot, those were portable. They were something that you could play. You didn't depend on either sibling or necessarily a group of friends. It sort of was complementary to your personality, to your interests, and it was something that fit in your lifestyle. But who gave you your first metal soldier? Grandpa wasn't a collector himself.
I think that Alexander has my very first soldier, at least the first soldier I can remember.
Yeah.
And I got that, I think, from my grandfather Harris when we went down to Cape May or Atlantic City or someplace like that when I was a boy. So, like many children, a lot of the figures ended up in a big paper bag,
Yeah.
and then they were
Yeah.
discovered. But since Cornwall was the base,
Yeah.
that was always a place that we always came back to. And so there was always some things there that belonged to me, and the things that belonged to me were usually these figures. So it really kind of assembled there.
Mm-hmm.
But to get back to my father did not approve of my collecting toy soldiers, but my mother was very much interested in having the children have a hobby. So the first defining moment, I think, as far as collecting was when I was 10 years old, living at West Point. A so-called aunt gave me for my birthday a musical typewriter. Well, at 10 years old, a musical typewriter is not really quite the kind of thing, I mean, that's for 4 or
No.
5-year-old kind of thing.
Right.
But the lucky thing about it was broken. And
Oh.
she had bought it from F.A.O. Schwartz in New York. And I can remember at 7, 8 looking at the F.A.O. Schwartz catalog and seeing these wonderful groupings of metal toy soldiers that they had on display. I'd sure like to get another one of those
Yeah, one of those old catalogs.
early catalogs to see
Oh, that would be so
see the
interesting.
figures. So so what was to be done with
The musical typewriter.
with the musical typewriter? It certainly wasn't going to, And I already had an army at that time. I had some. So I had maybe about 100 soldiers, but I didn't have any really good soldiers, and I didn't have any soldiers that I could get at F.A.O. Schwartz's. So this was an opportunity, and I can remember my father and I going down to New York in the car, and sometimes when I even travel on the road, I can still see myself as a 10-year-old going down the road to this.
Palisades Parkway, right? From
No,
Cornwall?
it was part of the Palisades Parkway, I think, that had been built, but it wasn't
Probably Route 9 or
completely
something.
built. Route 9, part of it was Route 9, part 303, I think. But anyway,
So,
um,
so the two of you went down together.
so we went down together, and we went to F.A.O. Schwartz, and I think that the value of the typewriter was very valuable in those days. $10 and
Yeah.
maybe it was $11.50. But anyway, $11.50 bought me 5 boxes of toy soldiers and a cannon. And so
Wow.
that was the beginning
Oh, that's so
the collection,
interesting.
and those figures are still in the collection. Although the, there was one set of cavalry and four sets of some charging, some marching, and this cannon. And I think the cannon has been replaced. The cannons is still there, but not the same, not the original cannons there. And the cavalry's just recently been replaced. Alexander has some of the figures some of the cavalry figures that I got when I was 10 years old. So that was really the start. And then my mother then for Christmas she would have either, because she had a very difficult time getting around, but she
Yeah.
did get around. I mean, she was on crutches and
So she was on
and
crutches
drive
at
a
this
car.
point.
She was on crutches and drove a car,
Hmm.
and she'd have, I think, my grandmother Harris. So for Christmas, I would get maybe 4 or 5 boxes of toy soldiers.
From that point. And were you interested in anything else in terms of toys? I'm
Not,
sure you had
not really,
activities and
because
things.
here you combine the organizational um, concepts with actual having the figures. And so I was always drawing up plans. I can remember going back to Cornwall, and we'd have a battle. I can remember having a battle with your Uncle Stephen. I still have a copy of his surrender statement.
That's Stephen Duggan, mom's brother.
That's right.
Mom's oldest brother.
Mom's
just for the
oldest
record.
brother.
Wow.
And I still have all the charts that I drew and the organization table
Oh.
and that kind of thing that I had drawn up. So by the time I left for England at age actually 13, that was the end point
Then
we're talking about there.
Yeah.
I had a pretty well defined hobby, which again, because my father stressed taking care of things, respecting things, and my mother helping me by getting figures.
And supporting a hobby and an interest.
Yeah, supporting the hobby. And of course, for Alexander and Matthew and Catherine, one of the things that's very important in my relationship with them, aside from the fact that I want them to know that their grandfather is very interested in them, very proud of them, and loves them very much, is that's part of my responsibility to see that encourage their sense of responsibility. I think they've done a wonderful job. I mean, it's wonderful to come up and see the figures that I've passed along to them have been taken care of as I would like to take care of my own figures.
Well, you didn't have a brother that was your age, and actually with having had 4 daughters, it's amazing to be able to continue the legacy through your grandchildren.
Well, I think it is, but I also think it's kind of, it's something that you and your sisters have done. Well, you and Deborah, because Cynthia and
Yeah, without having
don't have any children. But it's to set the example. And you can't make somebody follow the example, but by and large, if you set the example, more often than not, they will follow it. If it's a good example, or if it's a bad example. Luckily, you set a really good example.
Yeah.
For all of them.
We had great role models. Well, Dad, I want to go back to, because I don't want to move into your adolescence yet. I want to talk a little bit about, you talk about Cornwall, and of course that's such a shared memory for all of us. So that we have this on tape. You're talking about 23 Maple Road. Tell us
23 Maple Road.
Tell us a little bit about what a typical day was like back then. Do you even remember things like your meals and
No.
none of that?
No, I don't.
Did you have did Grandma have a lot of help back then? Did she have maids or nannies or any people to help with that
my grandmother
day-to-day stuff?
My grandmother had a nurse for my mother, Nana Taylor, but I don't remember any of the help. Now, before my memory of before I was born, my mother, I'm sure, my grandmother had, at least 2 or 3 servants, because on the top floor of the old house, there were at least 3 or 4 bedrooms and a bath. That was on the 3rd floor,
That
which
had the
was
intercom
service
system
quarters.
too, didn't it?
Don't remember whether there was an intercom
I do
system
remember
or
there was
not.
I do remember somewhere near they put that in when Susie was born, I think, or when you
Yeah,
moved
that's
in
right.
that house permanently. But
That's right, yeah.
I'm sure I know there was the back stairs, the back entry into the garage, so there must
Yeah,
have been.
that's right. And there was a
But,
sitting room for the help in the kitchen, and there was back stairs, so
oh,
that
that room was a sitting room. That room off the kitchen was used
yeah,
as a
it was
sitting
it
room.
was a, that was the servants' sitting room, and there was the kitchen was a very very big
It's huge with a big
very
bar
big
to sit
kitchen.
up
Yeah, and then
on,
there was a
and
pantry as well. The dining it was a lovely lovely old house, and of course, I guess at a later time you're going to talk about moving out of the house
yeah.
because your grandmother couldn't manage it anymore, and we
That
were
was a turning. I think that was just a milestone in our family. But
yeah yeah.
certainly having had all of us grow to adulthood while they were still in that house. Where would you have said was your favorite up to this point? Your favorite place to have lived?
Oh,
Did
I
you
don't think
like?
there's any doubt that Cornwall was a favorite place
Boy,
to be. I mean, we lived in Washington. We had a wonderful house there, which my parents wanted to buy, and they should have bought it. They could have bought it at a very good rate back in 1946. The house is still there. I go by it very often now.
wow, that's
But
so.
there was no, Army quarters were very nice. But I never placed too much stock in where we were, where we lived, and I don't remember too much about the routine,
But it was
except
familiar. It sounds like when you talk about that atmosphere of love that you had in your home. I mean, there
yeah,
was something comforting about familiar routines, familiar
yeah.
faces. Grandma was at home all the time, right? She
She
didn't have
was
an occupation outside the
no,
house.
she was at home all the time. Sometimes my grandmother Harris was there,
Yeah.
but it's really interesting. I don't have any really. I did not know my grandparents on my father's side.
Yeah.
I did not know my grandfather on my mother's side, and I barely knew my grandmother on my mother's side, although I was 13 when she died.
Yeah, but still,
And I didn't,
that's still quite young to. I mean, for your grandmother, she wasn't a great grandmother, but your
well, she
grandmother.
was, my grandmother was 68 years old when she died, and of course I'm
Oh,
65
that's
now.
young.
So, I think she had congestive heart failure or something like that.
But your grandfather, Jim, um, James Harris.
Yeah.
Um, there's a picture of you that Grandma always took such pride in with you on a horse next to Grandpa. But you don't have. But you were about 3 or 4 back
Yeah,
then.
I don't,
You don't remember him
I don't,
very well.
I don't really remember. My mother said that he used to give me plastic toy soldiers if I ate all my food when I was
That's a funny
four,
memory.
4 or 5. I mean, kind of a bribe. And I think I remember vaguely getting some plastic figures that quickly disappeared. Maybe they were cowboys, and I didn't.
Yeah, maybe they were cowboys because
Yeah.
certainly figures were not unusual
Yeah.
back then. Grandmother came from affluence, and grandfather came from a much scantier. I won't
Yeah,
say
yeah.
poverty, but I think he certainly had a strong work
Close
ethic.
to it.
But also a very big family. Did you ever
Yeah.
know any of your uncles? Were they
Oh,
they all
yeah.
stay in the South? Uncles and aunts.
Yeah.
And can you tell me their name? I know Rosa, certainly Rosa. And,
Well, the oldest
and
one was
Jessie and
the oldest one was. Let's see.
Rosa was the oldest, wasn't
Oh, I've forgotten what his name is now. The second, grandfather was the youngest. Then his
He
older
was,
brother was Lawrence, and I knew Lawrence a little bit. And then came Aunt Rosa, I think, and then Frank, Uncle Frank, and his son and I are very good friends.
she? And it's Belle also.
Frank Bell, yeah.
Okay.
And then there was another brother, Jesse.
Yeah.
And Jesse was owned a grocery chain in San Francisco, and then there was an older sister, and then the oldest brother. And the names escape me right now,
But you didn't see much of them because they stayed
no.
in the South. Did you ever travel south for holidays or anything?
No, we never
The way
traveled.
we are.
We never assembled as a family. Although I remember driving when we were living at West Point, driving down to visit my grandmother with my uncle Larry. He lived in Chester, Virginia, and he moved. We drove down. We actually got in an automobile accident I think the car was hit by a bus or hit a bus
Ooh.
in Atlanta, Georgia. Minor scrape on the car, and we went down to Pensacola, and Father had to go back up to Atlanta, I guess, for a hearing or something to that effect. But Uncle Carter was the oldest. Uncle Carter was the oldest. You might remember that we stayed with Uncle Carter's daughter out to San Francisco in California, in Palo Alto, I guess it was, or someplace like that.
Okay, I'm going to end you right here because I think I'm out of tape, so let's end right here. I do remember Carter. We were always so lucky to have your brothers and sisters as part of our growing up, and subsequently their children who are our cousins.
Mm-hmm.
So you also did, with Grandma having lost her only brother.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't have any cousins on that side of the family, nor really on Grandpa's side.
No close cousins. I mean, of course, they're the Brown cousin here is
right. Oh, Grandma's.
On your grandfather,
Grandma's
on your great grandfather's side, yeah, the Harris on the Harris side. Yeah.
Right. Grandma had. Grandmother's mother and father both had siblings that had children, so they were like your second cousins or your first cousins.
Yeah, and large families too. Yeah.
Yeah. Did the difference in their own upbringings? Do you ever recall that being a factor in their grandma and grandpa's relationship? Grandpa coming from kind of a farm, country, more rural life. I think he said his father was a country storekeeper, wasn't he? I'm not sure what Grandpa's.
Your grandfather, your great grandfather Bell was a ne'er-do-well who owned a family store and went bankrupt, and then being a streetcar conductor, and the strong person in that family was your great grandmother.
What was her maiden name, Dad? Do you know?
Carolyn Carter.
Carter. That's the Carter name is from.
Yeah, that's where the Carter.
Grandma Bell's.
You know.
But Grandpa Bell's, my grandfather, your father's really ticket out of that was the military. Was it an expectation?
Well,
This is jumping ahead a little bit, but from the time you were little, did you think you might be a soldier yourself? As Grandpa had talked about having gone to West Point as a young man.
No. Your grandfather really had no influence on really on whether or not what I did. See, his brothers were all self-educated. His brother Frank made it possible for your grandfather and his older brother Larry to go to Auburn. They were all Auburn, and they spent 2 years at Auburn.
And that's in
Carter was a self-taught engineer, and Larry and Frank were both engineers. Jesse was the only one who wasn't. And your grandfather Bell was going to be an engineer as well, but he had an opportunity to go to West Point after 2 years at Auburn, and then ended up going to West Point. Graduated. He would have been in the class of 1925 if he'd graduated from Auburn.
Is that right? So he actually started down. Started down there.
Yeah, but he was in ROTC, and he did very well in ROTC. But your grandfather Bell was not one to, he didn't take out his youthful frustrations on his children by making them wanting to do what he had not been able to do. He didn't live vicariously. He didn't live vicariously in this. So although he never discouraged me from going to West Point, and he helped me very definitely when I made the decision was very much my own. Mm-hmm. But because I had this military bent, if you want, and living near West Point, that kind of thing, it was. Well, we can talk about this later because we're in high school.
Yeah, I do want to get into. I want to way explore that later because certainly with having sons and contemplating what that will mean for them. Were there things as a young boy that you were insecure about? Were there things that you were insecure about that you would have thought?
No, because you didn't. One of the things about traveling around, you never could really be insecure about anything. I mean, you're always going to different schools. You're going to be. Now, I was never a star athlete, and I always in the back of my mind was always afraid that a bunch of boys would come gang up on me, and beat me up. So I was relatively frail. I wasn't a good. I wasn't a good athlete. Although later on, track, running was my.
Were there ever any bullies or any? Do you ever have any bad memories of any?
Yeah, when I was in the 5th grade, I played Abraham Lincoln, I guess, in the school playing and got beaten up by some bully who was in the 5th grade. I had a girlfriend. Her name was Kay Zitzman.
Okay, yeah. Tell me about any crushes.
She was. I saw her, as a matter of fact, just a few years ago, and she didn't look. It was exactly the way she did when she was 10 years old. Very pretty. Yeah. But no, none of the other boys had any girlfriends, and so. I don't.
Is that like a crush?
Remember? No, I don't know whether it was a crush or anything like that, but it was.
Somebody.
She was a really a cute gal, and there were about 5 or 6 boys in a gang, which I wasn't. I was never part of a gang. I was never part of a gang. I was really kind of a loner.
Yeah.
And I can remember getting off the bus one time and having to forsake my love because I was ganged up. I went to
Yeah.
summer camp one year, and I can remember one day there were about 10 of us in this tent, and one of their fun things was to gang up on one of the kids every once in a while. I remember they all ganged up on me, and I just fought like a tiger.
Yeah.
But no, I had, and I remember I was building some. We had shop in 5th grade. I was making some kind of houses out of blocks of wood. And Tommy Taylor, whose father was the superintendent at West Point, he was the top guy there at West Point, came by with a hammer and beat on my blocks, which was supposed to be houses. As I guess he was figured the next step was going to take the hammer and hit me in the head with it, or something like that.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But
You were spared any physical abuse at that.
yeah.
That point.
And I'm always. I guess I've always been the kind of person who's always, instead of staying and fighting, I always pick up and run.
Yeah.
You know, wanted to fight another day. Although I was never that way.
You're more passive.
Yeah.
What about teachers, Dad? Did you have any teachers that you remember like the one you talked about in Long Island that recognized your gifts and thought maybe you
I don't remember who that was, but I remember Miss Golden in 3rd grade in Oregon, because she was a very pretty.
Yeah. I always remember the pretty
girl.
one.
She had golden hair, and I think I must have fallen in love with her as 8 years old. She was a. I don't think she was an exceptional teacher, but I never had any teachers who I ever really thought were special.
Yeah. Even beyond your elementary school years.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Interesting. What about things like religion? I mean, with your family moving a lot, and I don't ever remember them having any religious. I never had a single conversation with Grandma about her religious beliefs.
No, we didn't.
But you grew up with very high moral values. What do you attribute that to? Just a good conscience and.
I think just a very positive family environment.
Yeah.
Father would like us to go to church, and he would go to church once in a while, but he wasn't a very religious person.
What was his religious?
Our
affiliation
was Presbyterian.
Presbyterian.
And Episcopalian, I think, more than anything.
How about when Grandma became sick? Was there sort of an oppressive feeling in your home at that time? I mean, that certainly thrust you into a different role with.
No, actually, I was very resentful because I remember when it happened was we went to I was firing. I belonged to this rod and gun club as a 10-year-old junior member, and I was firing up in the range, and they came up and told me that I had to come back from the range. I couldn't keep firing, and I didn't understand why, and I didn't like the idea. And then when I told I couldn't go anyplace for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So, you know, the whole.
10-year-old young boy. Were you 10 or a little bit?
10, yeah, I was 10 years old.
That's so young.
Never really. It didn't bother me. I didn't feel sad. And grandmother Harris was your great grandmother was very supportive. I mean, we lived with her, and she had help. I can remember your grandmother being carried down the stairs to the hospital at West Point because she couldn't move her legs.
But she didn't cry or moan or I mean, I'm sure she probably didn't cry.
I never. I don't think.
I don't ever remember at that age ever either of my parents ever crying or being.
Seems like that would have stood out in your mind if that had been.
Yeah.
And how about your sisters? What do you remember about them except for the fact they were just like hear no evil, see no evil, the three little monkeys? I mean, they were girls for one thing, and they were younger than you for another, so you probably didn't have too much interest in them.
No. I don't remember anything about them at all. Worthy of even
Of
even
even
talking. I mean,
commenting
I
on-
love my sisters, and they're
Right, and certainly as adults. you stayed
but
close.
there was nothing. Again, when I went to Cornwall, I'd get my bag of soldiers out and would go out. I'd go out and have maneuvers.
Yeah.
And they weren't involved in
Yeah.
that kind of. Although Betsy says that she was 8 years old and I was 10 years old, that she was a lieutenant in my army in
Yes, I wonder if they would have different memories because they
Oh, yeah.
may have memories of you that you don't
yeah, oh, I'm sh-
reciprocate of them.
yeah.
Did you love the house in Cornwall? And that was
Oh,
it
yeah.
similar to what it was when we were growing up with all the woods. I mean, obviously the woods were all around it. Did you spend a lot of time outside as a kid with your armies? And did
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
which part of the house did you sleep in?
It's on the second floor, almost right at the top of the stairs there.
And then what was the green room or what was across the hall?
No, it was a room right next to your grandmother's. Where the
Green
grandfather used to stay when he was there. You walked up the top of the stairs, and if you turn right towards the stairs there, you'd face the room, which I stepped in was your grandfather Harris's room. And there was the next room over to your right was your grandmother's room, and then the guest room, and then the room to the left was where the girls slept, and then the green room was where one of your aunts lived, and then the room down the hall, of course, was Madge's room. Always remember that as
Yeah. Well, let's go then to no, you're just about to leave for England.
Yeah.
So let's venture slowly now into adolescence, and let's hit this for a few minutes. 'Cause I'd like to know. So here you are at 13. Now, how would you describe yourself at 13, especially say, for instance, relative to Alice? Were you pretty tall? Where were you
Yeah.
physically? How would you have described yourself physically? Because you're certainly a
Yeah, Alex and I probably are about the same. I remember 13 was when I really started to be kind of. I got very interested in sports when I was that age, and I remember
is that
being
right?
on plane. They weren't in kind of organized teams like.
right.
But I played football. I played in junior high school on the class, not the classroom team. We go out for recess, and I'd play in. And because I could run pretty fast. I was able to do some kind of thing. So I was a pretty lithe. I very much like Alexander in terms of height and weight and that kind. I was also a scout. I was in scouting as well.
Yeah, you're Boy Scouting, not necessarily
Yeah,
Cub
and
Scouting. I don't think Cub Scouting was
I was
that
in Cub
popular then.
Scouting
Well, maybe it
someplace,
was.
but I can't remember where exactly. But I was in Boy Scouting very definitely in Washington, and one of the troop was on the corner, Congregational Church there, and I was also not a den chief, but what's it?
yeah,
The scout that helps the den.
Den Chief. That's
The
what they
den
call him
chief.
now.
Is that
Now, what prompted your interest in Scouts? Was that Grandma, or were there a lot of your friends or classmates?
Yeah,
that were involved in
I had
Scouts?
some friends, some good friends that were in the.
So that's what it was.
So
not
we lived
unusual
right
for you
across
to
from the
get.
school in Washington,
Do
and
you remember
so
which school?
the John Eaton School, yeah,
John Eaton School.
33rd and Lowell, still there. It's a very good school. It's been pretty
Is
much
that far from where you live now?
maybe about 10, 15 minutes walk. It's very close.
That's pretty close.
Very close, yeah.
And how many years were you then in Washington, D.C.?
2.5.
And what Grandpa was at the National War College?
2.5 years. He was there for National War College for a year, and then he was in the Pentagon for about 2 years, and then he had a choice of either going to Greece to be the General Van Fleet or going to England. And because your grandmother, her condition and him not being able to really leave her, he decided to go to England because we could all go to England.
Yeah, and be there
And
as a family.
that turned out to be a great experience. But I think your grandfather at that time, he might have gone higher in the military hierarchy had he stayed, had he gone to Greece with General Van Fleet, because General Van Fleet was an up-and-coming, very fine general who your grandfather had served with in the war.
And this is how old are you now? This is post World War II, pre Korea, obviously. So
This is 1948 until 1940. We went in 46, 47, 48, maybe into 49. 49, I guess, maybe was when we went to England.
now, when Grandpa was when you lived in D.C., young teenager, was your dad involved? I mean, he must have been. Was he home for dinner every night? Or did you see much of Grandpa?
Yeah, I saw it. And we used to do scouting things together.
Yeah.
He would go with like Kelly does with, and you do with the boys. I can remember one very cold scouting weekend where we all slept in this tent and had to get up and make the fire. Oh, it didn't snow very much in Washington, but we
got cold.
we went to Gettysburg, I think, one time camped out there at Gettysburg. And of course, that time my grandmother Harris had a heart attack. She died in 1948, and I was doing various things. I built an airplane model, which I put underneath the bed. And when grandmother came, they took her suitcase and shoved it underneath the.
Broke the
smashed
airplane.
my airplane, which is
Dad.
which was not.
You still remember that.
Favorite
Almost.
kind of things.
Do you generally have a good feeling about Grandpa? Did you feel like you could talk with him?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you could talk with your grandfather. I can remember a couple of times when it was very emotional, and your grandfather, would not be impressed with you. Wouldn't think he would be able to break down or cry. And I can remember that we actually cried each other's arms, and I think that's kind of a nice, neat thing to be able to say, particularly at a later time. Not when I was young, not when I was, at this time of my life.
Right,
but,
right, as an adult.
But later on, yeah, he was a very even-tempered kind of person. It was hard to really get him mad.
I think that would be my memory of him as well.
A very steadying kind of influence.
So when you moved to England, how many years were you in England, and where did you attend school when you were in England, and where did you live actually?
Well, we lived about a block and a half from Victoria Station, which is right there in the middle of London. I went to Westminster School. I was the first American boy to attend the Westminster School after the war.
Wow.
And for a year, I was the only American boy, and then another American boy by the name of Baker. I can't remember, it was John Baker, something like that. He came to the school.
Was it a private school?
It was a private school, one of the very best schools in England, as a matter of fact.
And an all-boys school?
It was an all-boys school. Today it's a co-ed.
So the girls didn't go
No.
to school?
They went to girls, exclusively girls' school.
Were Jimmy or Susan born at this point? When did they?
No. Jimmy wasn't born until I went to high school in Germany.
Oh, so you were in high school by the time.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to skip ahead there. So at this point, you
16 years difference, yeah, and then 18 years difference between me and Susan.
Oh, I had no idea there was that much of
Yeah.
a nation between you. Now, did you have a great experience in England, and did you travel while you lived there?
We traveled a lot when we were in England. We went to Ireland, we went to Norway, we went to Germany, we went to Spain, we went to France. We did everything.
Even with Grandma being somewhat impaired.
This was the big time for her because she planned the
her
trips
love.
meticulously and kept a diary, and the diaries are still existing, although I can't read
Probably
them.
can't read them. Maybe that's where your love of, and how you passed on down to us, which is something I'm so grateful to you for having done. Started as a young boy yourself with Grandma's love of that, because Grandma traveled from the time she was a young girl too, didn't she?
Yeah.
With always that home base being Cornwall. Did you get back to the States at all when you lived in England?
No. There was no really reason to go back to the States. We had 3 vacations a year, and each vacation was a trip. First one was to England, I guess it was, and Ireland, and then I can remember the Korean War broke out just about, that was 1950, when we were on our way to Norway.
Hmm.
And
So you were 15.
yeah,
Born 1950. So 15, the Korean War broke
yeah,
out.
1950.
And your grandpa had a tour of duty in.
No, your grandfather missed. Your grandfather,
He was
I
too old
think
for
he
theater,
always
okay.
kind of, you know, lamented the fact that he never got a chance to go, and that was because he was in England at the time.
What was your favorite trip of all those trips that you went on? What was your
I
favorite
don't
country?
I don't remember any of them as being favorite. I can remember that this was the time when I really I really had to be very responsible. I was in charge of two things. One was packing the car
Hmm.
because my mother, of course, couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And I can remember being in charge of making sure all the bags fit in the back of the car. We had this great big Oldsmobile convertible, which the English thought was really something fantastic. But and then I
funny
was
you have
also
that.
I was also the guide. So you know map reader. I was the map reader.
Navigator.
And the navigator
Yeah.
on the fact. And I can remember that one time the car broke down in Spain, and my father had to go to get the car to put on the ship, sent back to England,
Wow.
and I had to take my mother by airplane from Seville in Spain to Paris, and there we were supposed to pick up my father and fly back from there to England. I think it was.
Wow.
Anyway, but at 13 years old, that was quite kind of responsibility. But it was something that I never really, to me, never had any special significance because your grandmother always wanted to. She loved to go to the theater. So when I went to the theater, and I went to the theater, I go to the theater with her. I always would help her, you know, I mean, on crutches.
Sure.
So
you
you
had
just
the
had this
whole-
woman going down
navigate
the
the
aisle,
whole
and she
place.
kept saying, "Well, I'm in the people's way," and I could remember saying,
Yeah.
"No, grandmother, no, mother,
Yeah.
fine, take it easy. There's no problem. We'll get there." You know, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Mm.
So, but that would I never looked upon that particularly as being a kind of a burden.
Yeah, I
But-
would wonder about that because certainly probably very few, if any, of your classmates, much less your friends, had mothers that were physically disabled. And
Yeah,
did that
that
ever,
was
did it
actually-
ever make
no.
you ashamed or embarrassed? Or
No.
because at that age you're so self-conscious at 13, 14. But you were
Yeah,
probably
but again,
pretty
you
solid.
say that I was. I mean, I had very. I was pretty much of a loner.
Yeah.
I would go to a party, and everybody else, and 15 or 16 years old, and the overnight parties. So we just kind of sat around,
Oh, really?
you know, and
Oh.
talked, and you know,
Overnight.
nothing.
Nothing the way it is today.
Nothing sexual related or anything like
Yeah.
that. But you know, I'd get tired, and I'd go off in a room by myself. You know.
Sounds like me,
And
Dad.
go to sleep, and you know that didn't endear me to any of the other.
But that was by your choice, though. It wasn't because you. It doesn't strike me because you're so socially adept that was just what your comfort level was. It wasn't that
Yeah.
you wanted necessarily to be. Did you want to be more? I wouldn't have described. Would you describe yourself as introverted, or just kind of a contented, solitary kind of?
Yeah, I know. I don't think
Solitary.
I was because I never had any problems expressing myself,
Yeah.
and I had in school I had a lot of English friends. Most of the Americans were in the group there were very cliquish, and I was I never was a member of any kind of clique, never
Yeah.
been in a gang. And they'd go off and play basketball, and I was never invited to play. I wasn't very adept at playing basketball anyway. But my sports were, you know, I played cricket, I rowed, I played soccer, and I ran in high school.
So you're a runner.
And I wrote for the school, for the House magazine. I can remember a couple of articles that I had written there.
And what were your favorite subjects in school at this point? I had wanted to ask you
what?
that. Favorite subjects in school? Were they writing with your talent for writing?
History and geography were
Still your big interest.
my favorite subjects, and I used to do pretty well in math. My first year at school in England, I was in what they call a transitus, which was the lowest grade, like I guess, you know, transitioning from a lower school to the upper school. They put me in Transys A because I did relatively well on my entrance examination. That was A, B, and C. And at the end of the year, I was the second highest boy in the Transys, and that I'd come over from the States. I had practically no Latin. I had to take Latin and math and all kind. At one time, I was taking Latin, French, English, and German. I was doing four languages. And then at the end of that year, because I was a little bit older, I guess, than everybody else, they jumped me. They jumped me from the fifth form into what they call the shell, which was kind of preparation for examinations to.
Now, how old were you at this point? Were you?
I was 15.
So you were like a
15,
sophomore?
16. Yeah, let's see. I was 16. Yeah, I was 14, 15.
So you were how many years in England with all?
I was 2 years there, and then I went to Germany for a year.
Now that I do not remember in your family chronology at all. You were in Germany for a year.
Heidelberg. In Heidelberg, I went to Heidelberg High School. I was a junior from 1951 to 1952.
Is that an American school?
American school.
And Grandpa you got transferred, or did you just?
He was
just for a year?
transferred to Germany for he got a very prestigious job in the headquarters in Stuttgart. We lived in Stuttgart and went to school in Heidelberg, which was we took a train up every Sunday evening and came back every Friday evening. I was the treasurer of the junior class then. And I was on the track team. And I
Interruption,
played
right in your
football.
high school.
That was a great year because I was one of the 4 class officers, and I had just come from England.
Yeah,
Nobody
you were
else
a
wanted the
stranger.
job of treasurer. We had a wonderful class president named Walter Morgan. But that was very interesting because out of that class, I think there may be about 35 or 40 boys. Almost half of them all went to West Point.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, is that where your interest in German as a language came, or were you learned because you'd already been taught?
No, it's just because I had to take German. You had to take German. I was a C student in German.
Yeah, really.
In Germany, we had a attractive German
Teacher.
but that didn't.
Did you have any interesting girls back then?
Oh yeah,
Back
I had all
then?
kinds of girlfriends and stuff like that. But,
Because it was were an all-boys school, and you're a foreigner.
yeah, but see, we had this in London. We had this teenage club, and so every Sunday we'd all meet at the teenage club, and there were some pretty girls there, and of course I'm sure I had what was one of the 2 Clark girls, Bunny Clark. I can't remember what her first name was.
Well, now, had you met Mom by this point? Because
No,
you hadn't met
I
Mom,
didn't meet your mother until.
even though you were both from Cornwall.
Well, no, I'd known your mother, but she was just a squirt.
Right.
I mean, she was just a kid,
But
and she
she's
was a
4
friend
years
of
younger than
Carolyn's.
you.
Yeah, she's kind of Carolyn's.
So she didn't really turn your eye at this point.
Oh no.
No.
Not
You were-
absolutely not. No, she was just around. You know,
Well, when you were in England, did you have any crushes that ended in like a heartbreak? I mean.
no.
No, that's good. So you
No.
didn't get your heart broken when you were in
No.
high school. You look like you're.
No, I'm just trying to think, but I don't.
How about proms and things? Did you go to proms at that?
Yeah,
time?
no. I was responsible for the funding of the junior senior prom
I think I remember you telling me this.
in England. I was also editor of the school newspaper. I was on the track team. I was the highest scoring at one track meet. I got 3 seconds relay, and so I scored 9 points for our track team won that particular.
Well, you know that I ran track in high school and I did horribly.
Yeah.
You know that.
No, I don't remember that.
Yeah, I did that. I was very bad.
Yeah.
I
Well,
was
you were-
captain of the team.
You were captain
I
of
was
the team?
captain of the bus.
No kidding. Good for you. I
But
didn't
that
know.
was because I had the best team spirit. Not because
That's
I was the
okay.
best
Well,
person.
that's what a team captain is supposed to do, is to
I
have the
was
best
team-
spirit.
Terribly. I was a terrible runner, so I didn't. But I hadn't
Oh,
realized
okay.
that you were a runner.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
you were here. You were involved in school newspaper
yeah.
and treasurer of the class.
Treasure of the class.
So those years of having traveled and having had to adapt to new situations and make friends quickly, must have boded well for you then by
Yeah,
this
well, of
point.
course, another thing too was in the Army was relatively small at that time, and I would keep running into people who I had,
You would
you know,
know.
classmates. The Roosma twins, for instance, I'd known at West Point when we went to summer camp one,
Roosma
one
twins.
summer. You know, they're the contemporaries of mine, and their father was a provost marshal at West Point, I guess, at one time. But he,
Remember any of
and
that.
so when I got there to Stuttgart in the summer of 1951, I remember going to the snack bar where everybody went, you know, and at the snack bar there were the Roosmas, and so we kind of got our, and I don't know how, I mean, nobody knew me when I went to
Yeah.
to school that I should be a you know, elected the treasurer.
Yeah.
And I made the high school football team because I was fast, and then I got
Is that right,
and
Dad?
then I got
That's
a
so neat.
I got a
I don't know that.
I think the third or fourth practice I got sprained ankle, and so I never played. I played one game for maybe 2 or 3 plays. Never won a. I got my letter in track, but I didn't get my letter in football.
Now, were you thinking now about colleges at this point? Now we're moving into your mid
Yeah,
to later.
I was thinking about West Point, and I was also thinking about VMI,
Oh,
Junior
is that
Military
right?
Institute.
Yeah, yeah.
I went at the end of my at the end of my junior year. This is when your grandfather really took hold.
Right. Now this is when he would have had more influence.
When I was in England, I went to talk as a 14, 15-year-old. I went to talk to his congressman. He was visiting me, and had an interview with him and told him I wanted to go to West Point.
Mm-hmm. Planted the seed.
And grandfather said, well, you know, if you want to go, you need to go and talk to him. You know, so I went by myself, and then, you know, he didn't have to
He
go
didn't
with
push
me.
you? Because
No.
he was an alumni, and
No,
it had certainly
no,
been his.
He didn't really. He kind of put on. But then I took a physical examination when I was at school, and I found out that I had a bad heart, bad hearing, bad eyes, and one leg short of the other. And the people said, you know, there's no chance you're ever going to make West Point.
But they said those, and I want to do a whole session with you on West Point and your experience there, and even going back to the admission there. But those things had not been an issue for you, and then in fact into your academics or anything prior to this point. So must have surprised you to know that you had those things. And your heart was a heart murmur. What was the?
Yeah, it was supposed to have been a heart murmur or something like that.
But
But it was, I mean, eventually everything was overcome. I
Well,
mean,
obviously history will show that they didn't end up being a deterrent for
Yeah.
you. But did you seriously think about any other college? Did you ever think about staying in Europe?
I wanted to be no, absolutely
No,
not.
you knew you wanted to leave there.
I guess I thought about going to MIT because I was thinking about I wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to be a combat engineer. So I think was what I wanted to be, kind of thing, an army engineer. But there were a lot of the people who were a lot of my classmates in high school. Were all, you know, it was all kind of like, well, you know, West Point was a natural choice. They
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
both classes before me and after me in school.
And there was a lot of prestige still at that point. I mean, West Point remains highly regarded in so many circles. But was that at that point that was a prestigious place to have been admitted to?
Not
Okay,
necessarily.
it wasn't, 'cause now it seems-
I never looked at I was never sophisticated enough to look at whether or not going to that particular school was prestigious or not.
Yeah.
That was just a place where I thought I would get, you know, a good education, as limited as my interests were at that particular. I mean, I had a great time in high school with different, you know, doing different things and having, you know, girlfriends but I was always very busy. The class treasurer, we were always putting on different fundraising activities.
I was going to say, there wasn't just keeping the money. You were the fundraiser.
Oh yeah. I ended up every time I used to sell Coca-Colas on the train going from Stuttgart to Heidelberg and back from Heidelberg, you know, to class fund. We made $600 that year. That was a really significant achievement because we had the junior senior prom in the castle. Nobody paid anything to go. We had dinner, dancing, band,
flowers, decorations, everything, which were paid
All
for.
covered by the money that you
All
had
covered by the
helped.
money. And we had money left
I've never
over
heard of that.
for a hayride.
Oh,
But at the end of my junior year, I was promoted. And this is what my father was instrumental. He got me, based on my schooling in England and my schooling in Germany, I skipped my senior year in high school. So I graduated with the
Oh.
class of 1952. So
is that
I'm a
right?
member of the class of 1953 and the class of 1952
Is
at
that, so
Heidelberg.
you never had a senior year in high school
I
then?
never had a senior. I went to prep school for a year, and that's where I really learned.
Is that? Oh
That's
my
right.
gosh, I never knew that. Well, I want to just, because I'm running out of tape in here,
You know,
but I want to ask you, because during this time then Susan and Jimmy were born, how did that affect your family dynamic at this point? Because you are now
I was
so grown up. They weren't really much a
No,
part of your early
no.
life at
Well,
all.
Susan
then.
was not born. Susan wasn't born
Right,
until
'cause
we
you-
got back.
she wasn't born
Jimmy
till you
was
were
born.
18.
Yeah, he's just.
And he was just a baby.
Just a baby. Just something to have around the
Yeah,
the
did that
household.
seem odd to you to have a new baby when you were
Not
in
particularly.
your
I-
later years of high school?
I was so, my orientation was so much on
Yourself and-
on school, and I wasn't during the week. I wasn't home.
How about, did you ever have any fights with your mom? Do you remember having struggles with her or battles with her?
No,
No.
I don't think with either of my not until we got involved in politics at a later time. But
Isn't that a great memory though, that you don't have contentious memories of your parents as a
No,
teenager?
no,
Because many
no.
people do.
no.
That's a breaking point in a lot of kids' relationships.
Well, again, I didn't have, your grandmother was not a very touchy-feely person,
Yeah.
and your grandfather was not so much either, kind of thing. Although I think I'm very much a touchy-feely
You're very,
kind of person.
very demonstrative, which is funny because I would describe my family and my upbringing in our home a lot of affection. But you're right, I don't remember
Yeah.
a lot of affection from Grandma Bell, but I also think that's because she wasn't mobile.
Yeah. I think when I really started, my relationship with your mother, was when I really started to be feeling, became kind of a touchy-feely kind of person.
Yeah, yeah, because I would have not have ever gotten that impression that you had grown up in a home where there wasn't a lot of physical affection. Because even now, I mean, aunts and uncles, lots of hugs and things like that. But you still felt a closeness with your parents, even though it wasn't a physical closeness.
Yeah, well, there was a certain amount of, I think unrecognized dependency on my mother on us. It's a physical dependency because for us to do things and go places, and she never was the kind of person that was just going to hang it up. She wanted
Right.
to do things. I mean, she was always wanted to
Right.
go places.
That didn't
And
break
so
your will.
in order to do that, she went really agonizing type of things. And so we're always in a position of she depended upon us, and we kind of
You rose to that.
she certainly, I think she really felt she depended upon me and Carolyn and Barbara. Betsy kind of took herself out of the loop as far as that was concerned. And Jimmy, of course, when Jimmy,
Yeah.
and I don't remember too much of Jimmy's and Susan's because
You were long gone by the time they
Yeah,
were even
yeah, well, I mean,
in school.
Yeah, you and Jim and Susan are of the same generation, so
Yeah, it's funny because as an adult watching, as a young teenager I would have not have recognized the age gap because I thought you were always very wonderful to your brother and sister. You always,
well, Jimmy and I are in spite of the fact there's 16 years, we're very close.
yeah, I think given that
Yeah, yeah.
much of an age difference and the generation issue and the things that were happening when Jimmy was growing up were so different, even just from a tradition and moralistic point of view. Life was so different when Jimmy was hitting like the 60s and 70s. And I'm going to end here. We're going to end basically here at high school.
Yeah, let me
and
just
pick up. Okay, you want to say
let me
some
just say
final words?
one final thing. You
have some
mentioned
time.
Jimmy. Jimmy and I and our father were very, very compatible when it came to dealing with people who we had to have business dealings with. Jimmy and I see very much eye to eye on how we dealt with our subordinates, and we got that all from our father. I think that's an important memory of
Because certainly Grandpa was quite old by the time, was quite a bit older, of course, than he was when you were born, and yet those traits were ones that sort of transcended time and age.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, Dad. Let's end here. We'll pick up on West Point years.
Okay.
Dad, this is
Hope I'm
fall
looking
of-
handsomer today.
You look much handsomer.
Oh,
I
okay.
thought you looked handsome last time.
Oh, pfft.
We are going to continue my interview with Dad. Dad is now, Dad, how old are you right now?
I'm 66 years old.
66 years old. And we had the first part of our interview that took us through childhood and through the earliest recollections of Dad's first years in high school, where he spent some degree of time in England, and that's where we left off. And you were 16 when you left England, Dad?
I was 16 when I left England.
Why don't you tell us where you left, where you went to after you left England, and what was the status of your family at that time?
Well, let's see. Let's start the summer of 1951. I've just finished my second year of school at Westminster School in London, and I went to the summer camp for 2 weeks of the for cadet training, and it was there that I was promoted. After that, I was promoted to Lance Corporal, which is kind of like being a private first class in the American Army, and it's a promotion that you normally don't get until you've passed a couple of tests. And I don't know whether they knew I was going to leave the school or whether or not what the rationale behind it was, but I did get promoted, and I still have the stripes which I put on my bathrobe when I went to West Point.
Now, is this a military distinction, Dad? As a
Yeah, military.
high school
So it was and all young men had to either go into the Boy Scouts or they had to go into the Cadet Corps, and there was a Navy portion and there was an Army portion. So this was still very close after the war, and all of the masters in the school were also most of them had been in World War II. They had been officers in the Second World War. So my housemaster was the head of the cadet corps, and I was in the recruit company that went to camp that summer. That was fun because we also went to see the graduation parade of the Sandhurst cadets, which is the equivalent of West Point, and
In England.
In England, and it was a very important event for them, but also it was kind of a unique distinction to allow the cadets, a few of the cadets, of which I was one, to go to watch the parade, the final parade. Really, what they call a lot of square bashing.
Is that a
That's-
colloquialism? Is that something?
That's what the British call doing drill, close order drill, and they march back and forth and smash their feet on the ground, and it's very impressive because they have steel taps on the bottom of their boots.
Now, that's a lot. That was more regimented than what you were doing, isn't that?
Well, yeah, we were kind of. It was possible that once one left Westminster School to go to Sandhurst if one didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge or University of London or something like that.
Dad, what was your address in England at the time? Do you remember?
Yeah, 14 Ashley Gardens, right across from the Catholic Cathedral in London, right off of Victoria Street. And it was about 8 blocks from the school, so I could take the bus every morning to down Victoria Street. And Westminster School was right by the Abbey. It's actually part of the Abbey, and right across from the Houses of Parliament.
Where was your dad? What was your dad's place of employment? What was his job description at that time?
He was the American intelligence officer who was an observer to what was become the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. And he was there for 2 years and had British, Dutch, French, I guess, and Belgian compatriots, I guess you might call companions, or also who are also liaison officers to this organization that was just beginning to kind of get off the ground.
Did you see a lot of him at that age in your life? Was he like a 9 to 5
No,
type
because
of?
I was in school 6 days a week, and on Sunday, we used to go to the teenage club.
Uh-huh.
But then we would go, on holidays, your grandmother would plan trips, so we went to Ireland, and we went to Scotland, and we went to Denmark, and Sweden, Norway, Spain, France, Austria, and places like that. So,
So that's what instilled the love of traveling in you, was your
yeah,
your mom's-
it was a really kind of an educational type of thing, because we went to see places where Father was during the war, and we visited one place that I went to visit again, 1999, with a group of people. It's been about 50 years since almost 50 years since I'd been there.
Now, how many family members would you travel with at that time? Is it just grandma and grandpa?
Grandmother and grandmother, and Betsy and Carolyn and Barbara. So there were 6 of us. We drove in a 1948 Oldsmobile convertible, which had electric windows that went up and down.
Did you not fly when you had to go off of Great Britain? Did you
No,
fly?
we went by car, went by ferry. We took one trip to Ireland and Scotland and went to see the Scottish Games at Balmoral? I'm not sure whether it was at Balmoral. It was up in the northern part of Scotland. Braemar Games. It was the Braemar Games, not the Balmoral is where the Queen lives.
Right. Yeah, I know.
We went to Galway, and your grandfather kissed the Blarney Stone. I was too scared to even go up the